just put them on my desktop. We're supposed to have a couple of ethics and values classes here, so I don't know what happened.
Oh, well, I don't mind it smaller.
All right, good morning to everyone. Welcome to day 3 of Ethics Awareness Week. My name is Brian Birch. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Ethics here, and it's my privilege to work with my friends and colleagues across campus to help host this annual Ethics Awareness Week series that we've been doing now for over 30 years here. And it's an honor to be associated with the center and to work with so many good people. So I want to publicly thank everyone who's been associated with the events of this week, and to know of how appreciative we are and how much it affects our students at campus. So our theme this week is shaping our futures, and so we wanted to host a number of events that looked at kind of broad macro issues in society. And so we've had panel discussions related to climate change, AI, education, and the like. And an issue that we think is relevant and interesting and provocative is this issue of viewpoint diversity. So we hope that when you walk away from this session that you'll know what viewpoint diversity is, how it's seen by those who advocate it, perhaps the perspectives of those who have questions about it, and that it will give you food for thought as you move forward in your experience here at UVU. So I'm very happy to be in this session with two of my friends and colleagues here. So to your right is Dr. Andrew Bibby. Andy is an associate professor of political science here at UVU, and he also serves as the associate director in the Center for Constitutional Studies. And his work focuses on American federalism, constitutional liberalism, and citizenship education, among other areas. And some of you know that Andy works very closely with the Federalism Project, and it's a wonderful effort by students and faculty here at UVU. To his right is Richard Cho, who is an assistant professor of political science here at UVU, and Richard focuses on public opinion, race and ethnic politics, campaigns and elections, political communication, and immigration politics, just to name a few of his areas. I'm happy to have them both here to talk about this issue. So as I see it, my job in this session is to help describe our terms, perhaps offer a definition, to provide a framework for our discussion, and to perhaps ask a probing question or two to help fuel conversation. But what we're hoping in this session is that you all will be active in the discussion, and we've carved out time for what we hope is a very productive and lively conversation there. So the first point, I think, in introducing this topic is just to make the obvious statement that people are diverse. People come from different cultures, they come from different family structures, racial and ethnic identities, religious communities, gender identities, socioeconomic backgrounds. People have different values, life experiences, and formative events. There's a sense in which you can say that though human beings occupy a common physical space and we share common biological characteristics, you could say that we live in different worlds. And by world, I mean the way in which people gather information, value information, the paradigm and the concepts through which they understand, right, how nature works, how their experience operates, individually, how society operates, and we know there's tremendous how people shape and learn. Of course, this point has never been more evident than in our current post-truth, create your own world media environment. A side effect of the information revolution has been that people have access to more information now than at any time in human history, right? By exponential amounts. And those paying attention to public discourse in the United States are recognizing the diverse and conflicting ways in which people process information, how they value it, how they communicate it, and most importantly, how they apply information to their experience. But as we've seen from various scholars, information is not truth. So some of you may be aware that there's a new book out by the author Yuval Noah Harari, the person who wrote the book Sapiens, which was a national bestseller. He's got a new book out by the title of Nexus, and the entire book is about how people synthesize information, information networks, and related issues related to confirmation bias, epistemic bubbles, echo chambers, all those things that we've been hearing about in terms of information. But most relevant to our purposes is the fact that people don't agree on what truth is or how to access it. And that's what we get when students come to the university. We get a diverse group of people who may share some characteristics in common, some ideas in common, but many who do not. And one of the things that we've been talking about here at UVU is the fact that even though we live in a relatively homogeneous community, ethnically, racially, religiously, there are all kinds of ways in which our local community is diverse. And the way we've tried to understand diversity is more expansive than the traditional identity markers of race, gender, socioeconomic status. We've tried to value and recognize the importance of those, but also expand it to include things like religious diversity. And what we're hoping to talk about today is viewpoint diversity and how we can think about viewpoint diversity as it relates to other forms of diversity that we are trying to cultivate, recognize, honor, and facilitate here on campus. So with that in mind, let's look at a working definition. So I'll take a volunteer to read this working definition, please.
The inclusion and representation of a wide range of perspectives, opinions, and values within public discourse. It is essential for fostering healthy debate, strengthening democratic processes, ensuring that individuals have access to varying viewpoints that can challenge their own beliefs.
All right, thank you. So this is a very broad definition. There are a number of ways in which you can describe and define viewpoint diversity, but the idea is that people have different ideological perspectives, different political beliefs, different ethical values, different norms of behavior, and from the standpoint of advocates of viewpoint diversity, this is something that the university can and should leverage for the betterment of our students. And so some of the objectives of it include first just to increase awareness of ourselves and other people, right? So we know that it's a basic point of learning that it is impossible to fully understand yourself or to robustly understand yourself without being exposed to others. In other words, your own ideas are shaped by your interaction and your dialogue and your engagement with other points of view. The second objective is to cultivate intellectual humility, right? It helps us to recognize that there are people in our orbit, in our neighborhoods, right, in our classes, that may share many things in common, but they may share a very different perspectives. They may share a different perspective on the world in terms of their political beliefs, for example, and the values that they bring to those. And a third objective is to develop open-mindedness and critical thinking skills. And critical thinking is at the heart of higher education, and something that every faculty member on campus should be thinking about in terms of how they educate. So this gets us thinking about how viewpoint diversity applies to higher education. And just a last point or two that I'll make is that universities are designed to different ideas, to give scholars and researchers the opportunity to engage in open inquiry in an atmosphere of academic freedom, freedom of speech, all in the pursuit of truth, right? So the whole idea behind the modern university is that we're pursuing truth and that we're doing it by means of dialogue, debate, research, right? Testing our ideas and becoming aware of and dialoguing with ideas that we may not share. So just a couple of concluding points before we turn it over to our experts here. And the first thing to think about is the idea that there are limits to the value of viewpoint diversity. So it should go without saying that we should not recognize or engage with or value any viewpoint. And so any conversation has to set limits on what is allowable in terms of discourse. So a common example that people will use in public life is the example of the Flat Earth Society, right? There is such a thing as the Flat Earth Society, and they support the idea that the Earth is not a sphere, but is flat. And For most conversations within any kind of scientific or rational discourse, right, that would not be one of those viewpoints that should be or could be entertained. So although the viewpoint diversity cultivates a spirit of openness, open-endedness is not infinite, right? There needs to be some kind of guardrails. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to have productive conversations and have a common understanding of what truth means. The second observation is that the term viewpoint diversity has been politicized in a way that can distract from an accurate and productive understanding of the term. You know, so that viewpoint diversity is most often associated with, right, the effort to advance conservative ideological viewpoints on campus, right? And that is obviously one of the main areas of focus. But in principle, viewpoint diversity is an openness to different ideas regardless of where they stand on the political or ideological spectrum, right? And to take them up in a kind of spirit of openness so that the university is not a place that is closed, that is a closed epistemic community that has its own kind of echo chamber. And we know that that's been one of the criticisms of higher education lately by lawmakers and various critics, is that universities are not a place of open inquiry like they could be. So with that said, I'll turn the time over to Andy, and then we'll proceed to Richard. Yeah, there you go.
All right, well, okay, that was good morning. Thank you, Brian, for that wonderful introduction, and I want to also say thank you to both Professor Birch and to Professor Robert Burton, in particular from the Center for the Study of Ethics and the Center for Constitutional Studies, for helping to put together this event today. I think Brian's framing of this question is extremely helpful. Thank you, Brian. We can now maybe hopefully get to some of the more interesting issues, or maybe more thorny issues, if that's where we want to go. This is obviously an important and an interesting topic because it touches on so many things that we care about as students, but also as teachers and administrators and staff here at UVU. I have to admit that when I was invited to...
You'll have to use the arrow, for the clicker's not working for some reason.
The arrow, the keyboard.
The space bar works.
Okay. I have to admit that this is how I felt, and perhaps how my colleague, Professor Cho, felt when we were asked to join the event. Not because we don't care. In fact, I think both of us do care about the topic and find it fascinating and relevant to what we do. But because it's a hard topic and it intersects with some of the big culture war controversies today that give people like me, who generally try to stay out of culture war issues, heartburn. I also struggle with this topic at times because I know that so many people have different reactions to the term viewpoint diversity. For some, it might mean an attack on DEI, like epistemic relativism. So this idea that all viewpoints are equally valid, and so the more the better. So maybe we should have a journal for flat earth studies. If all viewpoints are equally valid, then there's no problem with dedicating some of our resources to make sure that those are represented. Maybe we should also have a chair in geocentrism, We could go down the list of topics that we don't necessarily need to entertain in academia. So my background, I am a member of Heterodox Academy, and I'll just mention this briefly because there are three main values that most of us ascribe to in different ways. But the first is open inquiry on campus, and the second is viewpoint diversity, and the third is constructive disagreement. And the basic principle behind that is the idea that great minds don't always think alike. So this is one of the other reasons and virtues for promoting and increasing viewpoint diversity on campus. I also have to say I teach 3 courses where this is part of my everyday life, and it's an issue that comes up almost every class. In political philosophy, in American heritage, in American federalism. So political philosophy is really the history of ideas. And the history of ideas, when you study it, is really the history of disagreement. And so one of the first things you learn when you study the history of ideas is that great minds don't always think alike. In order to find the truth, in order to get closer to the truth, we have to entertain possibilities or alternative ways of thinking, doing, and being. And so my job as a teacher in political theory is dependent upon viewpoint diversity. I would say maximum viewpoint diversity. When it comes to the American heritage, we spend a lot of time in my classes talking about where the American heritage came from. And we spend at least a couple of weeks on the English heritage, the European and the colonial heritage, and the Native American heritage. In my class on federalism sounds like a boring topic. It's really just the division of powers between different levels of government, but it also has an important principle behind it that animates this constitutional system, which is the search for unity and diversity. The idea that we need to try to balance these two goods: unity, a nation, a government of laws, and a diversity. So it comes up in my teaching, and it's also just important for me because I do teach a class in critical thinking. So if you take a class in critical thinking, you'll notice, or one of the things that you will study are the obstacles to critical thinking. This is not the only one, but confirmation bias is a big one. And so that's what I'm going to focus my few minutes on, is this idea of confirmation bias and how viewpoint diversity can help mitigate some of the worst effects of confirmation bias. So what is it? So it's a cognitive bias. It involves systematic errors in thinking that affect judgment and decision making. And it stems, most people think, from the brain's attempt to simplify the informational landscape. So in other words, confirmation bias as a cognitive bias is as old as the human brain itself. So it's rooted in mental processes, it's including perception, memory, and reasoning. And so that's one of the reasons why it's important. So how many of you have seen something like this? I think this is a decent illustration of confirmation bias. We have our beliefs, and we have the whole world of facts and evidence. And there are 2 ways to sort those through, right? So there are facts and evidence that we make part of our beliefs, so we integrate into our belief system, and those become what we believe. And then there are facts and evidence outside of that we sometimes, I don't know if any of you have done this before or noticed yourself doing this, ignore some facts or evidence that might seem inconvenient to your own beliefs or your worldview. So I want to take an example here, just quickly. So an example of confirmation bias would be, I'm trying to get in shape and I come across an ad that says chocolate is good for you, which is exciting because that is definitely a belief that I would like to hold. So I click on the report and I give the site my email, because in this example, you have to give your email to find out why chocolate is good for you. I don't know why they would do that, and I find some great news. Chocolate has antioxidants that protects your cells from damage. Dark chocolate has polyphenols, which reduce blood pressure. So those are the kinds of facts that are easy to remember because, well, I like chocolate. So this is one example of confirmation bias in information seeking. I am seeking for pro-chocolate sources, and I am more likely to look for news that supports my views, even if the source is a bit shady. And I'm more likely to ignore information if that contradicts that information, even if it is from a reliable source. Confirmation bias also happens when you interpret ambiguous information in a certain way, even if all of the information is not only on your side. So a good example is when traders or people that are new to the stock market, or maybe inexperienced brokers, make bad investment decisions. Almost all stock trading is by definition ambiguous. If it wasn't ambiguous, we'd all be doing it, and I guess we'd all be rich. I don't know how that would work. But people still make decisions on stocks because it feels right. Or someone on Twitter said that Dogecoin or GameStop was going to the moon. And then when it doesn't, or when the price of GameStop or Bitcoin goes down 80%, people hold on to losing stocks. Those are called bag holders, convinced that their original analysis was correct. Have any of you invested in Bitcoin? Put up your hands before. Okay, good. So none of you are victim to confirmation bias on Bitcoin. I won't ask you about Dogecoin. We'll leave that aside. Okay. So the last way that it affects us is in terms of memory recall. Numerous studies show that people are more likely to remember information that supports their belief, but forget information that doesn't support their belief. This is called selective recall, and it's quite nasty because it can reinforce views over time and lead to echo chambers and dogmatic thinking. When I clicked on the chocolate news article, this is what came up. I have no idea why someone who would want me to believe that chocolate is good for you would also ask me to schedule a free call with them. In any case, it seems like a reliable source to me. So, is cognitive bias always bad? Well, cognitive bias and confirmation bias particularly comes out of the need to have heuristics. Talked about the primitive brain a few minutes ago. And the short answer is, humans would not be here today if we didn't have it, if we didn't have these heuristics, these cognitive shortcuts. Our ancestors had to make quick decisions, relying on established beliefs, such as a moving stick might not just be a stick, or the stick hanging from the tree might be a snake, or as my son calls it, a nope rope. So confirmation bias is what saves you from grabbing the branch and finding out the hard way that it's an African rock python. Here's another example. If it will play, I'm not sure. Maybe you've seen this before. Yeah, this is from Utah recently. How many of you have seen the short clip going around of the cougar encounter in Provo? Okay, you've seen this before. I don't know if I need to play it for you. The person in the video is being tracked by what he calls a kitty cat. And if you watch the video, you look at how he responds. Notice that the person doesn't wait to be attacked before deciding to find out if it's just a kitty cat. So let's assume, cognitive shortcut, unhappy, dangerous mountain lion, and then we can ask questions later. So in these kinds of situations, summarizing, confirmation bias helps us in a number of ways. I'll just quickly add a few more here. Other benefits, it can help us to avoid mental overload. It's a way to filter out irrelevant data. It can help with social cohesion. Some researchers say it resolves ambiguity in and among kin groups, and so might have helped with cooperation and group harmony. It can reduce cognitive dissonance. It helps, and this is a psychological concept that refers to the discomfort or the tension that arises when a person holds two or more conflicting beliefs, values, or attitudes. So Daniel Kahneman said that it helps us in the search for coherence, which reduces mental discomfort. So why is confirmation bias a bad thing? And remember, it's not always a bad thing. If you see a stick in Provo Canyon that is moving, my advice to you is confirmation bias first, ask questions later. The thing is, that doesn't work in the universities, and that doesn't work in the academic environment. So the very things that are virtues from our experience, from our ancestors, and that come out of our primitive brain, can become vices if they're not checked. So the idea of mental simplicity, simplifying the world down to a number of heuristics, can turn into dichotomous thinking, black or white. I'm on your side, I'm on my side, you're on your side. There's no way that we can agree on anything, and anything that you say must be wrong because it's a part of the package of beliefs that you hold as my political or ideological enemy. Social cohesion. So again, it performs an important role, but in an academic setting, it can turn into a vice, it can turn into groupthink, and it can turn into persecution of those who don't either ascribe to that certain set of beliefs or approaches to problems, methodologies. Cognitive safety. That can turn into ideological victimhood and circular firing squads. And this is something we've seen on college campuses. Don't have time right now to get into some of the data on this. I know Richard may want to talk about this, but you are probably by now familiar with some of the stories. And all of this is exacerbated by what Brian mentioned, polarization, use of social media, and so on. Okay, so let's now get to sort of some solutions, and then we'll probably leave the rest to Q&A. So the first is just awareness, understanding how it operates and recognizing it when we fall prey to it, practicing critical thinking, and instead of seeking confirming evidence, ask yourself what evidence or approaches or viewpoints exist that might contradict my view. My own belief on this is that you can't lose either way. So that if you encounter opposing beliefs to your own, either you will find it unpersuasive and you will reject it and you'll be more firm in your beliefs. Or you might find it persuasive in some way and therefore enlarge your beliefs, maybe even change your beliefs. So seek diverse perspectives, and that's what viewpoint diversity is all about. So is it happening on college campuses? The good news is that it is not as bad as some people say at four-year public universities, the problem of political and ideological homogenization. Colleges can and still do provide opportunities to counter cognitive biases. Take a look at these mottos and just tell me what they say or what they represent. Okay, so this is the the motto from Harvard. Okay, Veritas. This is the idea of pursuit of truth through education and research. This one is a little bit harder. This one is from Yale. What does that mean? Anyone know?
Light is light and truth.
Light and truth.
The Hebrew is also basically light and truth.
Exactly. I think it's Oram V'Thomim. one more. I found two mottos from University of Chicago. Yeah, pay attention to the first one. Anyone want to try to pronounce that in the Latin? Be happy to take a volunteer. There's a journal on campus which takes this title. I feel like I want to put Chair Dessart on the spot here. But...
That's a history thing.
Okay, don't talk to Jay then. Okay. Okay, so the translation is, let knowledge grow from more to more, and so be human life enriched. All right, so that's the good thing, is that universities can and still do uphold that mission. There's some bad news, and we'll get into this again in the discussion. Many colleges are falling short in their own missions, and some things are getting worse. So again, for discussion, here are some examples. Ideological imbalances between self-identified liberal and progressive professors versus self-identified independent, libertarian, and conservative professors. Attempts to sanction professors for speech that is found to be offensive. Support for censorship and investigations of professors who pursue controversial research. Can give a good example of that in the Q&A if you want. In general, just attitude studies that show that professor feelings about their own colleagues is getting worse. There's one study that shows that 80% of self-identified progressive and liberal faculty members say that they dislike conservative voters. It's not much better on the other side. About 60%, according to this study, find that of libertarian, independent, and conservative scholars say that they dislike voters on the other side. Self-censorship and the fear. So it could be the fear of being investigated. It could be the fear of losing grant opportunities. Could be fear of being brought before some kind of tribunal. So all of these things we can get into if you want in the Q&A. So just wrapping up, you might be thinking, does this really affect us? And you know, we're not Harvard. We're not part of that Ivy League system where all of the videos are going viral from those campuses, right? And I think I agree with that. Things are better in four-year colleges than they are in the Ivies. But my own opinion is that what happens there does affect us here. And so the most important way that it affects us is how the general public views higher education. So you've probably seen something like this before, but from 2015 to 2024, the percentage of people who say that they have a great deal of confidence in higher ed has gone down from 60 to 36%. The percentage of people who say they have very little or no confidence in higher education has gone up from around 10% to 32%. What are the reasons why people think that way? And this is interesting for its own sake. If you look at why people say they have no confidence, or people that say they do have a confidence, and you ask them why, 13% of those respondents say that it's the quality of the professors that counts. 24% say it's the opportunities for jobs or success that counts. 27% say that it's important for society to be educated. And 19% say that thinking for oneself and respecting different points of view is really what matters. So the point here is 59% say that having a good professor who cares about educating society and helps students to think for themselves and respect different points of view is what gives them confidence in higher education. So I think that's one of the most powerful arguments for getting back to intellectual diversity and viewpoint diversity. Because I'm out of time, I'll just be happy to take questions and let Richard come up and take the stage. Thank you.
Okay, so I have some prepared remarks that I'll be reading from as we have this just brief presentation behind me. So thank you very much for the introduction, Brian, and I appreciate Dr. Bibby's presentation on this topic. As someone who went to the School of Motivated Reasoning in Political Psychology, I can definitely appreciate kind of your approach to the topic of confirmation bias. Maybe I'll invite you to give that lecture in one of my classes. I have to admit that when I was first approached to participate in this panel, I was a bit reluctant, as it was not a topic to which I'd given a lot of thought. Throughout my time in academia, I had heard and participated in informal discussions with peers about the importance of intellectual diversity, political, ideological neutrality in the classroom. So it's not like this is a topic that's completely alien to me. I'm just gonna pause and lift this up because my neck is hurting.
Just pull it straight out.
Just, I don't wanna break it.
You should.
All right, yeah. All right, thanks. Okay, but based on what's already been presented in this panel, it's clear that the debate has evolved significantly over time. And as Dr. Bibby mentions at the end of his presentation, it's become increasingly controversial, divisive, and politicized. In fact, had I known all this in advance, I probably would have declined the invitation. But in a way, I'm glad I didn't, because in preparing for this panel, I've actually ended up learning a lot about the topic and kind of how the topic is currently being discussed. And I've realized just how much I've been influenced by it and how close I've been to the topic without realizing it. So my approach to this discussion of viewpoint diversity in higher education will be based on my experiences as both a scholar and as a professor. So before the debate over viewpoint diversity was injected into colleges and university classrooms, it first emerged within the area of academia and scholarship. The need for a greater level of intellectual diversity was first raised towards research within the social sciences. My own field, that of political psychology, was actually one of the initial battlegrounds where this war was being conducted. It was actually the famous psychologist Philip Tetlock who, in 1994, when the field of political psychology was first emerging, was compared the field to politicized psychology. And as a trained political psychologist, I can confidently conclude that an aversion to ideological or political homogeneity, while received critically by many in the field at first, has resulted in important critical dialogues regarding theories involving racial attitudes and implicit biases. So to illustrate, I'll give you just one example. Decades ago, a group of psychologists created a way to measure implicit bias towards different groups using a highly sophisticated software that measured response times in a series of cognitive decision computer tasks. The test was initially called the implicit associations test, but quickly came to be referred formally as the implicit attitudes test. As a measure of implicit bias, political psychologists were quick to explore how it correlated with attitudes towards race-based policies such as school busing, affirmative action during the 1990s. And the idea was that the IAT would be able to detect whether an individual was implicitly biased against African Americans, and that implicit bias is then what defined their opposition to these race-based policies. But the use of the IAT as a measure of positive or negative attitudes towards a particular group was met with a small but fierce opposition within the field. The most notable was from a group of researchers who asked the question, would Jesse Jackson fail the IAT? These researchers pointed out that the rapid response nature of the test didn't necessarily capture the implicit bias that an individual possesses related to a racial group. Instead, they argued that it captured the psychological accessibility of negative racial stereotypes, which are often heavily ingrained through repeated exposure over the course of one's life. And yes, the accessibility of negative stereotypes will be greater among individuals who consciously endorse those stereotypes. However, these negative racial stereotypes are also accessible among those who do not endorse these stereotypes at all, and when given the opportunity, consciously reject them. Because of these valid criticisms from a small but vocal group of experts, the discipline gradually moved away from calling it the implicit attitudes test and instead used the more accurate implicit associations test. Now, that small adjustment in the field of political psychology reflected a major reversal in what the IAT initially purported to measure. In addition, the distinction between implicit attitudes and implicit associations has served as a foundation for subsequent research that has explored the controlled versus uncontrolled aspects of implicit bias. Now, that example is just one of the numerous cases where the sincere pursuit of knowledge and truth resulted in the further advancement of scholarship on a topic deeply mired in the political world. While the study that announced the emergence of the IAT was published in arguably the most prestigious journal in the field, the criticisms and pushback responses, including the Arts and Tetlock paper, were limited to smaller, lesser-known outlets. And this made it difficult for these criticisms to gain traction at first, though eventually they finally gained mainstream acceptance within the discipline. The silencing of dissenting voices in research and scholarship does a disservice to the higher mission of advancing truth and knowledge. This is a belief that is at the heart of the mission of various academic groups and universities across the United States. At Harvard University, the Council on Academic Freedom recently issued a mandate for faculty hiring committees to emphasize intellectual diversity in their decision-making. So the interpretation of this call to action seems to be fairly straightforward. According to the Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard, the people in departments who are responsible for hiring new professors should try to identify candidates who, based on their scholarly record, embrace disfavored positions when those positions reflect a notable percentage of the American public, are not ignorant of widely accepted and established research on the topic, and have the capability to significantly influence society and policy decisions. According to the Council, an emphasis on intellectual diversity in the hiring of faculty will facilitate an increase in intellectual diversity in the overall scholarship produced by the faculty. Now, let me briefly shift my comments to the more recent emphasis of viewpoint diversity in higher education, and note here that I will no longer be using the phrase intellectual diversity. There has been a growing movement to increase the ideological and political diversity of academic discourse in university classrooms across the country. This movement points to accurate data that shows that an overwhelming percentage of faculty and staff at universities are either registered as Democrats or possess liberal ideological orientations. This fact has led some to believe that these professors are indoctrinating students to be more favorable to democratic policy preferences and neoliberal ideological principles. Their proposed solutions are deeply disturbing for a multitude of reasons, but first, let me address this false narrative as characterized by Dr. Lynn Pasquarella, head of the American Association of Colleges and Universities. Surveys conducted on student populations show that an overwhelming majority of college students do not believe that their professors are trying to push their own political biases in their classrooms. In fact, longitudinal panel data on college students show that there is not any noticeable directional shift in positive feelings towards certain political groups or ideologies at the expense of others. The data just does not support the claim that the students are becoming more liberal due to their experiences as college students. But the far more problematic aspect of this debate over viewpoint diversity in higher education is the proposed set of solutions from those who repeat this false narrative. To increase intellectual diversity in academia, Jonathan Haidt once petitioned the Society of Personality and Social Psychology to include more conservatives in their membership. Now, the attempt to mandate a similar order in higher education raises much more practical issues. A university or a department can't realistically expect to make employment decisions based on who someone voted for in the last presidential election or what their thoughts are on the capital gains tax. Now, as an alternative, More tangible proposed solutions have involved the mandatory administering of student surveys on university campuses, asking questions like, how well do college instructors welcome students' opinions? Do faculty give credit to students for voicing uncommon opinions? And how well do faculty invite students to share their personal or political viewpoints? And this last question seems especially problematic, and it goes back to the whole issue with just putting more conservatives in the classroom. This doesn't seem to address any concerns around a politicization of the classroom. If anything, it just seems to exacerbate it. Contrary to what these critics may argue, the classroom is not a place for a free expression of political and ideological viewpoints. It is a place for learning and truth-seeking, and this proposed politicization seems to run counter to that mission. Now, I do agree that the sharing of diverse viewpoints is crucially important to maintaining public spaces and a healthy democracy, but the classroom is not a public space. It is not a town hall. In my own experiences, it can be hard enough to teach lectures on important fundamental topics like how a bill becomes a law or the structure of the federal judiciary without devolving into student debates over political issues related to Congress and the courts. Now, I've been fortunate that the students are not taking these classes to engage in political debates, but instead to learn the factual basis of the material. I can only imagine how disruptive it would be, not only for myself, but for the large majority of students in the class, if every lecture was encouraged to become a back and forth exchange of partisan and political talking points. I thought that's what the internet was for. University classrooms would just become another space defined by hyperpolarization and vitriol, and I'm sure those of us here who truly care about higher education do not want that to happen. And finally, I will end with the acknowledgement of just how politicized this issue has become. Prior to 2015, among self-identifying Democrats and Republicans, there was mostly agreement on the beneficial effects of colleges and universities in the country. However, since 2015, we've seen a sharp drop in positive evaluations among self-identifying Republicans. When it comes to the false narrative around political biases from professors, survey data from 2018 shows a huge gap between Democrat and Republican attitudes. Since 2018, the issue has become only more politicized. It is imperative college and university students across the country are protected from the negative effects of this politicization and that we emphasize learning and knowledge above all else. And that's it.
Thank you.
Okay, hopefully that was stimulating and provocative. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A and discussion. This ends at 12:45, so we're anxious to hear your questions and input.
Can I just speak or do I have to wait for it?
Wait for the mic, please. Thank you.
I know you're a stickler about that. So when I'm hearing the different speakers coming up, I'm kind of presented with this two different views about how viewpoint diversity might take place in the classroom. One kind of seems like a more pluralistic idea where we are supposed to consider both sides or as many alternate viewpoints as possible. And the other side, it looked like might be more of a strict separation between kind of partisan opinions and facts in the college. And so I'm just wondering if that is really the distinction that we're making, whether there can be whether there is no room for a separation or whether there is separation. Can you actually separate completely a viewpoint from the facts that you might want to learn in a class? Or are they mutually, do they need to happen together? Are they codependent?
I'll try, but there was a lot put out there by Professor Cho. I'll try to maybe answer to both if I can. So it seems to me like the counter statement was really not so much focusing on the fact that there's a problem, but what do we do about it? Would that be a fair characterization?
what you're asking?
Yes.
Well, I would think by my use of the word false narrative, I would, sorry. I would question whether there is actually a problem that needs to be solved.
Okay, because the first part of your talk, you did say that there's a problem, especially with liberal conservative ideological domination. But then it seemed to say that you were more worried about, okay, what do we do about it? And what I'm trying to get to here, Richard, is that I agree with you in part on the solutions. So let me try to see if I can show you why I do agree with you. So I think your main concern is that we don't want to have a kind of affirmative action program for conservatives. That'd be a fair statement?
Yeah.
And I agree with this. So there are other state solutions, and my own preference would be to avoid solutions that come down from the legislature without each university trying to address the problem from within through culture. And through having forums like this where we can come up with creative solutions on our own and find ways to address what people perceive to be an imbalance, if you will, or something worse. Let me say this. So I think there's also kind of a straw man argument that you're making. Richard's a good friend, so I can say these kinds of things, and we say a lot worse to each other.
I told him I wouldn't use a straw man, but
So
apparently
he knew that was coming. He knew that was coming. So the straw man argument, I think, is something like this, that the only solution out there is to hire more conservatives. So just a quick data point on that. 60% of liberals in the general public are in favor of something like that because they agree that viewpoint diversity is as important as demographic diversity. I don't know what to do with the next data point, but it shows that the same survey shows that 19% of liberal, self-identifying as liberal academics don't think that viewpoint diversity is as important. So I think there's an interesting disjuncture between public opinion and academic public opinion. But the point I wanted to get to is that there are cultural solutions outside of this radical idea that we just let all viewpoints have an equal say, and it just becomes Twitter, and everybody is equally depressed and unhappy, and makes our classrooms worse. So just as an example, as one, I could see administrative efforts and using student services to open a discussion with them to adding viewpoint diversity to other diversity initiatives on campus so we can talk about it more, including the downsides. So that would be one, and then I think the next would just be not to worry so much about trying to correct for a political imbalance, but just continuing to make the case to our students that viewpoint diversity matters regardless of the political bent of your professor. So I would say it's a false choice to say, you're here just to get a job or to get an education. I would say you can do both. And then to do both, you should look for ideas on all sides, including the ones that disconfirm your pre-existing beliefs.
Well, I'm unsure if I should respond to that or if I should actually respond to the question that was asked. But I guess I'll start with the question. So, Carter, I think that's a really good point about kind of potentially kind of disentangling between those two things. And I think, right, some instructors in classrooms are going to have a harder time with it than others based on the material that they're teaching. Fortunately, as someone who teaches within the social sciences, basically there's a lot of gatekeeping done that's, kind of at the higher level when it comes to what's being published and the scholarship that's being put out there that is then being taught in the classrooms. And at that level, I do agree, as I stated in my presentation, that I think intellectual diversity when it comes to being able to explore those ideas, right, from other experts within the field, I think is important, right? And I think as we'll see a greater level of intellectual diversity in the scholarship that's produced, I think we'll see kind of this trickle down into the classrooms. I think for other faculty who kind of are kind of having more philosophical, more critical dialogues related to these topics, I think it's a harder question as far as how they can disentangle the two. But then kind of shifting to my colleagues' comments, so I don't think there was a contradiction in what I was arguing as far as saying that, you know, when you have intellectual diversity and an emphasis on intellectual diversity within academia and scholarship, but then also pointing out how the conversation around intellectual diversity is not the same as the conversation around viewpoint diversity in higher education. And I do actually like the idea of universities kind of being more proactive in helping to facilitate these types of on-campus initiatives to make sure that student opinions and student voices are not being silenced or repressed on campus, but I don't think that should then apply to the classroom, if that answers your question.
Here's a way of perhaps framing the question. It's to throw out the idea that while we all agree that one of the goals of colleges and universities is to expose students to diverse points of view. But then the next question is, or one of the next questions is, how do you do that? Where should that diversity lie? Should the diversity lie within a single class, right, where a professor or set of professors introduces students to different ideas within that particular class, and that there should be an expectation there? Or should the diversity lie in the experience of the students between their professors and between their classes, right? So where you might have a kind of single viewpoint or a single orientation. In one class, you would take a class from another professor where you would get an entirely different approach, perhaps to the subject matter. So there's context number 2. Context number 3 then is, should we look at this exposure in terms of the content? So not necessarily the classroom or the university itself, right? But should the diversity occur within what they are doing in the field, right? So do we think about it at a more macro level? And I think sometimes the conversation gets a little confused about what context we're talking about when we're trying to foster diversity. I'd be anxious to hear.
No, I totally agree. I think it really depends on what scale you're looking at. So if we're talking about classroom discussion, that's one thing. If you're looking at faculty hires, that's a completely other thing. The chair is in the room, so we won't get into that. Department level issues, administrative issues, it really depends. And the law of scarcity applies to academia. And so the fact is, even if we want to go out, and even if I agreed with you or with the people who proposed this, to hire an equal number of libertarians and independents with conservatives, the reality is that this is not going to be how it works. Most departments are struggling just to cover the basic subfields with their own discipline. And so I kind of agree with you to that extent. I think I would just say something from my own personal life, my experience growing up and going to school in Canada. I went to a school where the ideological diversity was not great, but I'm not even sure because it didn't matter. I still don't know what my professors' political opinions were. And I still think I got a good education, and I'll give you an example. So I had a Marxist professor that taught me Chaucer. I had a postmodern professor teach me Victorian literature. And I think I got a great education from both of those professors, and how they leaned politically to me didn't matter. I think the issue comes into play more, and maybe responding to Brian, is the question of what are the things that are not being talked about. So it might be possible that my John Rawls professor can tell me what John Locke really thinks. I think it's less likely that my John Rawls professor can tell me what Thomas Aquinas thinks, or what Edmund Burke thinks, or what Aristotle thinks. So maybe it's naive, but my hope would be that a university finds ways to not only teach a diversity of content, but try to find a way to encourage professors who actually believe the things that they're teaching, to give students the best opportunity to engage with those ideas from people who actually believe those ideas.
That takes us to the question of kind of the classroom context. So a very practical application of this is that I teach ethics and values. And I teach ethics and values alongside approximately 40 other professors who teach it. And each of us has a different way of approaching the classroom, where in my classroom, you're going to get a style of teaching where I'm trying to focus as much attention on the content as possible, where the diversity lies in the content and what they're reading, and then my ability to help do justice to these different viewpoints. But then they're going to move to another section of ethics and values, and they're going to have much more of an advocacy-oriented approach. I'm not saying either one of those is correct or incorrect, but there is a tension, I think, between the idea of taking a class so that you understand what the professor really thinks, which is built into the concept of professor, all right, versus a classroom where what the professor thinks is secondary to the content. And I don't think that's been fully resolved. It certainly hasn't been resolved in my experience with my colleagues and other people in my field. And I think it's a tension that kind of sits in and around these questions we've been raising today.
Well, if I could just add a quick comment to that, I definitely understand what Dr. Bibby is saying and what Dr. Birch is saying, but at the same time, I believe that you can be, excited and stimulated intellectually about a topic to the point where you can be an effective instructor in conveying that material to students without having a personal psychological commitment and attachment to the material that you're teaching.
Yeah, I mean, that's the ideal. So my Marxist teacher who taught me Chaucer, obviously a lot of people do that well. I'm just not convinced that it's enough. So where I might go with that is another example. So I took an English literature class, and I was given a book on day one called Beginning Theories. And what we were taught was to value all critical perspectives equally, and then to choose a lens. So there was a whole series of chapters on Marxist or critical approaches to literature. You had postmodern approaches to literature. You had feminist and environmental approaches to literature. And I went through that class and felt like I had been exposed to a huge range of diverse ways to approach books. It wasn't only till later that I realized that there was a couple of lenses that were missing, which is the lens that you may not have to take a lens when you approach a book. That was missing. The idea that you could approach literature from a great book's perspective, that was missing from the curriculum. So what I'm worried about is the illusion of diversity. We've got all these people teaching these different fields, but we're also missing out on different approaches to books, which I think is even a bigger problem. When I asked my professor about this, like, where can I take a class in my major on the great books? And my professor said, well, we don't do that. You'd have to go across to a liberal arts college. So that's what I ended up doing is I went across to the street. Thankfully, we had a liberal arts college, and I could engage with the text on that level. So I think that's an example of how we might think that we're covering a broad range of perspectives, but is it sufficient? And I think a lot of people are wondering and thinking, no, it's not sufficient.
Let's throw it back out. Thank you.
Is it on? Yep. My question would be then, at what point does it matter what their political association is in terms of diversity in the classroom? Why does their political association have to matter? Because they already have, like the professors, for example, in the classroom, have their own diverse experiences aside from politics. So like, I've like had some of the most meaningful experiences with professors when they've been sharing from their heart and their own experiences, and a lot of times it's not even like politically aligned. So like, at what point does the diversity fall away from like politics and whatnot? At what point is that more important or less important? I guess is my question, if that's answerable.
So I appreciate that question, and I guess I'll take a page out of Dr. Bibby's book and kind of use an anecdote from my formal education. So when I was in grad school, kind of engaging in these debates with colleagues about the question of whether professors should kind of be open about their political or ideological biases, right? I was someone who maintained that I think it's important that, as an instructor, that kind of we maintain that, I guess, pretense of neutrality. But then, for my colleagues, they raised the valid point that kind of exactly what you're saying, right? That, the students know that kind of we're human beings, and that sometimes kind of just being able to reveal something about yourself personally with your students kind of just really helps the level of engagement. And I've had the fortune of being able to sit in on my colleagues' classes while they're teaching and seeing how they engage with their students, and I can definitely conclude that right, they aren't kind of trying to indoctrinate their students, right? They're not kind of injecting their own biases kind of needlessly into the topic in order to kind of shape political or ideological preferences. So kind of the question of neutrality versus kind of being more open about your biases, I think, right, is it's a kind of an even debate. But I think what's important to note is that the research that has looked at this, the research that has been done looking at student populations, right, definitively shows that the large majority of students don't think their professors are trying to right, kind of convey their political biases to their students. And there's also additional research. I didn't have time to kind of package it and put it in the presentation, but I came across some really interesting research in showing that students are actually able to effectively and accurately discern between what would be considered bias and what isn't. So it's not like they're just oblivious to it, right? The research shows that students know what political bias looks like, and they also know that they're not being exposed to it in their classroom environments. So
I think you're right too, both of you are right. There's a study from the New York Times that shows that 80% of students, aren't really affected by their political views, even if they share them in class. But again, I'm just skeptical of the idea that, well, at least the hope would be that they don't do that, right? The real problem is what's being left out. I'm sort of repeating myself. So what's being left out? Maybe not a problem when you're in an astronomy class. I don't care what my cosmology professor thinks either way. All I knew about my cosmology professor was she had funny red rubber boots and she memorized everybody's names and she was a great teacher. Don't care what she thought. I think it becomes more important when you go down the uncertainty scale into the humanities and especially politics, the study of politics. So I think it matters that if you're trying to expose students to a wide range of views that have influenced the trajectory of the country, that you should have not only conservative and libertarian and unorthodox viewpoints included in that, but also opportunities for students to engage with professors who have spent their life working in that area. So it's not necessarily about their party identification. It might be more about their expertise. Maybe you're really interested in taking on Edmund Burke or something, right? Maybe you're interested in taking on Karl Marx. You go to a professor who, has spent their time studying Karl Marx, they'll be able to help you with your research project, I think, more capably than someone who's just trying to check a box and teach it as one of many possible viewpoints.
And I'll also echo that recommendation and kind of just how important that is, and that's why when it comes to faculty hiring decisions, taking into account diverse viewpoints, right, within kind of established research paradigms, I think that is something that could be very beneficial, and I think that is something that is very actionable as well for hiring committees in universities. And I also agree that the impetus should really be on the instructor and the professor when it comes to providing that diverse viewpoint related to those topics, but then also making sure that students don't feel kind of persecuted based on kind of their positions within the context of that material.
Yeah, great point. We are at time. Just a parting thought perhaps in connection to the last point. Andy raises a good point about the question of discipline specific, right, values and virtues, so that it wouldn't be appropriate for a professor in a arithmetic class or geometry class to raise the kinds of issues that we're talking about here so much. And so there comes what comes to bear on the conversation is what is appropriate to your discipline. And academic freedom, which we all value and treasure here at the university, right, that comes with limits that is tied to what is appropriate to your discipline, right? And so it doesn't mean that we as professors can inject anything and be expected to be protected under the auspices of academic freedom. So that's another thing that weighs in the mix. But thanks to you, Richard and Andy, and to all of you for coming. Please join me in thanking them.